One of Justin Trudeau's principal legislative achievements during his near decade as prime minister was the legalization of marijuana on October 17th of 2018. But nearly 7 years later, what was once considered a golden goose is now more of a cloud of smoke blown away, according to the author of a new book. Here to talk about Catch a Fire, the blaze and bust of the Canadian cannabis industry is author Ben Kaplan. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Easy question, Ben, to start us off. What made you write the book?
I just couldn't believe that things were changing so rapidly, and this law that had been in place, a bad law that had been in place for 100 years, was changing in real time, and that the companies behind this that were looking to capitalize on the change in legislation were NAIFs, were startup companies that didn't know heads from tails, where I would love to say a good anecdote is a company with a $15 billion valuation had investor relations at gmail.com as its, how to get in touch with their investor relations team. And I just said, as a journalist, this is a great place to play.
It sounds like a lot of these folks, at least the ones in the beginning, didn't know what kind of business they were in exactly.
Well, 100%. I mean, and you got to understand, a lot of these companies started in 2013 when we had medical marijuana. So imagine the value prop of your business is one thing when it's medicinal. So say 1% of the population, less, much less than 1%, but a really fringe thing, but it could still be profitable. It could still be a business. But then when Justin Trudeau comes on the scene, and says suddenly it's not going to be this particular medicine, but it's going to be more like beer. It just changed everything overnight.
Well, let's go back to that to those early days. For a brief time, legal weed, as you put it, it was intoxicating, like Silicon Valley. If you swapped out computers for blunts, great line, by the way. What happened?
Well, I mean, because then, okay, so once you say that the market is going to go from medicinal to recreational, right? So recreational beer is recreational, okay. So you don't need because you used to need to get a referral by your GP to get legal pot. It wasn't hard to get, but at the same time, that's a huge barrier to entry. But now, when you can just get it at your corner drugstore, oh, this is the sliced bread. And then you start having prognosticators at Deloitte, people that are saying these things that it's going to be bigger than the spirits and the beer and the cider and all of that stuff combined. Everybody, and this is before these products existed. So, for instance, Canopy and Bruce Linton and them were very much bullish on making cannabis drinks, cannabis beverages. And the thought was that these cannabis beverages, ultimately, Bruce Linton believes, and he still believes, that you're going to go to the keg and with your steak and shrimp cocktail, you're going to have like a cannabis martini. And why shouldn't you? Because it's if everything keeps playing through. But the thing is, so the stock prices were built upon these notions. Since none of this had been done yet before, it's all sort of like wishful thinking. And nobody could say it's not true because we were first. Canada was the first G8 country to legalize. So it's like there was no track record. So anybody could say anything that they wanted. And there was reason to believe these are expert salesmen backed up by Deloitte. Why couldn't the numbers do that? Like maybe it just so happened that they didn't.
Well, you point out at one point Canopy Growth had a market cap of $22 billion, making it worth more than U.S. Steel. Certainly not the case today.
Not the case today at all. I mean, these companies, they lost 99% of its value. I mean, and Bruce Linton, who's sort of the main character of my book, maintains that if he had the time, that the company could still be worth that. Eventually, right now, there's something like, let's just say there's 10,000 SKUs in Vancouver. Okay. You don't need 10,000 SKUs. There's not 10,000 breakfast cereals. There's not 10,000. There's too much. But eventually, what's going to happen, like what happened with banking, what happened with our grocery stores, it's going to get truncated. And the ones that are going to survive are going to have the monopolies. At that point, and if Canada has its first mover advantage, because at this point now, Canada distributes more pot around the world than any other country. So we're selling in Australia, we're selling in Israel. And for a lot of these cannabis companies in Canada, we make better money selling abroad than we do domestically because it's so competitive here. It's a race to the bottom in terms of the prices. So what goes for $4 in Germany is $1 here. And it's actually, even when you factor in going through the airport and all the packaging and all of that, it's better to sell into Germany than it is just down the street. So what I'm trying to say is though that eventually these companies, when one is left standing, it could be worth that, but it's just at this point now, it certainly wasn't, and they were never doing anything revenues close to that.
So that kind of covers off the Blaze part of the story. Now, when we get to the bust, uh, Terry Booth, who is the founder of Aurora Cannabis, says that Ontario and BC sort of uh, pooped the bed on the
Yeah.
rollouts of legal marijuana, placing the blame on the regulators and not on companies like his own. Is that a fair characterization? Is that what happened here?
Well, I always think that I would put the blame on investment bankers and the hype cycle and everybody. The companies shouldn't have been worth that much money. Even if the regulators did everything perfectly, they were still never gonna, sales weren't gonna match the pace of spending. The company's market share would go up with the more money they spent to buy these ever larger greenhouses. So Terry Booth had a greenhouse that was so big that when you got out of the airport in Edmonton, you smelled his pot. And the pilots landing in Edmonton would complain because the roof on his greenhouses would refract into the light of the cockpits. His massive. So I don't think that the regulators making more stores was going to do that. There was no demand for marijuana never matched the wildest aspirations of what this could be. So I think that's an over exaggeration for sure. And the regulators they were inventing the template as they went. So it wasn't like they could just take what we do in Sweden and do it here. It's like, no, Sweden and all these other places are following what we're doing and doing it in their place. We didn't follow anybody, which again is such a cool thing about this story that Canada was actually first. But so what he was saying though is, there was a lot of problems with the rollout, as you can imagine. When they first legalized beer, I'm sure there was a lot of problems, in the 20s. Um, so if there was more stores, right, the stuff was kind of hard to get originally, as you can imagine. And there's been a lot of little stuff like the packaging and the labels on the packaging and how to open the packets. I don't know if you've ever tried this stuff, but if you get like marijuana in a legal package, the lid is very hard to take off because they wanted to, above everything else, they wanted to make it safe, you know. And I maintain that the health regulators, maybe they didn't do everything they could to make these businesses as profitable as humanly possible. What they did do, though, from a public health standpoint, because no one even knew, and if there was, you can't legalize marijuana, but it's like Canada did. And actually, the reason why I would say, like, do I think legalization was a success? I do, because it's like, we didn't have like rafts of people dropping out of school or suddenly, the highways are no longer safe. Like, and there's this gigantic rush on Doritos or anything like that. Like, we didn't see any seismic change in society. So now they know in Europe and Israel and all over the place, South America, everybody that's sort of following influence from a health standpoint. And we're decimating the illicit market, which is taking money out of gangsters' hands who then use that money and they wash it into guns and fentanyl and all sorts of terrible things. Not everybody, but the way I understand it from the police, the wide variety of people that are dealing in illicit marijuana are not like the hippie with no shoes that's just doing brownies at a Jack Johnson concert. Like, no, it's gangsters that are washing this stuff. That's why when you see these busts, there's always like automatic weapons and, all sorts of grenade launchers, like horrible things. So what the idea was is to help eliminate organized crime, which is what we've done in essence.
Now, a big watershed moment for the industry was the COVID-19 pandemic. Legalization happens in 2018. The pandemic comes it's declared a full-on global health emergency in March of 2020. And many of the founders of Canadian Legal Weed are being forced out. The people in charge go from being hobbyists and potheads to people who are experts in selling consumer goods. What do you think drove that transformation there?
Well, it's interesting because what it became about at first, they thought what it would be is like the value proposition was like this really like gourmet, like a gourmet wine or something like that. And that does matter that you have a beautiful science to make this wonderful flower, which you open the thing and it smells amazing. But really what it is they're widgets. And you just have to get a lot of them out of there. And you have to replicate it and you have to do it at scale. So it becomes a lot more like, then you're this beautiful botanist and it's more like packages of Tylenol that needs to be and this stuff it has to be and that's what they had a lot of hard times doing when they bought like this 1 million square foot greenhouse is to replicate the exact same product. So a consumer packaged goods, CPG, Coca-Cola or something like that, they're experts at distribution. It becomes much more about your distribution channel, and how you can automate, how you can get the stuff out of there. So it become a lot more science, a lot less art.
Where would you say the industry is now? And I'm going to read a line from the book here. Due to terrible margins, the existence of too many
Yeah,
shops, and the still mighty presence of black market weed, many of
yeah.
the retailers, except chains, will be closed unless something changes soon. So what needs to change?
Okay, I like that. Okay, what needs to change? Well, okay, there's still too many illicit market stores that are open. Like it doesn't make sense, and a consumer could be forgiven for not knowing. Like I know in Vancouver, in Toronto, all over the place, you could be forgiven for, an illegal store operates with impunity, which makes the legal market that collapses the whole value proposition of legal marijuana in the first place. So how they can be run with impunity and not charge taxes on their products and not have it tested by Health Canada. So for one is we need to go further towards eradicating the illicit market. That's one. The second is it needs to be right sized, like anything in capitalism. I mean, at one point, Terry Booth said there was a poo in the bed by the way the regulators rolled out. What he meant was because there wasn't enough stores. So everybody wanted a store because when there wasn't that many of them, they made a killing. Then everybody got in after them. They were like, wow, having your stores are great. I'll make a killing. Well, not when everybody does that. So there's too many stores. So you see it now. You can see the stores closing, and that's going to continue to happen. Unfortunately, what happens is the mom and pops who only have one shop, who can't buy their product on scale, can't survive losing margins. I mean, some of the bigger chains can survive losing margins because it's like they know it's going to be a war of contrition that if you can last now, when everybody else goes, it's going to be back to making a killing again. So, and it's very hard. This is a product really where you kind of want to go for convenience. Originally, they set out to make these things look like Apple stores or, it's like buying a Jaguar. It's not. It's like buying a six pack and you're not going to travel across town to go. Even if you love Johnny who's selling you the six pack, you still just want a six pack. You're not going to schlep to go to the store. So I think what's going to happen is more right sizing, more stores closing. Unfortunately, conglomerates being the things that's going to last. Um, but they're going to work it out like a Dunkin' Donuts or a Domino's Pizza.
And finally, who are the winners and the losers in this book?
That's yeah. Well, I definitely think the winners are Canadian people. I mean, I think there's more options. I mean, I'm a father of two, and I think for my kids, the world they're growing up in now with less. I mean, I'd much rather see my kid during Frosh Week at university, take a gummy than drink wild turkey. So I think from that perspective, we've all won. And actually, by winning in Canada, the world sort of wins because we've seen that now from a public policy standpoint. I mean, if you want to really say like what companies, I mean, it's still a win for Canada. I mean, these companies have still put $151 billion from taxes has been extricated. So it's like, we've win and that builds roads and hospitals and trains. I don't know, so but in terms of like who made out, like who's making out right now, if I had $50, what stock would I invest in? I mean, there's a company called Organogram and they're doing very well. There's another one called Canara, and they're doing very well. Canara's public, Organigram's public. Both of them have CEOs. Especially Organigram is a woman named Bina Goldberg, and she's been around and she stayed in legal. You know, and I think they had something like 17 quarters in a row profitability. So, medium-sized brands, the early companies, Terry Booth and Bruce and all of them, spent so much money to have the largest imprint they could because they wanted to be biggest first. Now the companies that are run much smaller, I think the largest privately held company is called Weed Me, and that company doesn't grow weed at all. What they're doing more like is they take from the different farmers that weed, package it again because it's a CPG operation, right? It's a consumer packaged good. What they're good at, they've got relationships all over, but they don't have the overhead of having one of these huge greenhouses. So they take pick and pluck and all that, but then they put it on their imprimatur, Weed Me, and people know the brand. So they're doing very well and they don't have the overhead. So those are three companies that I think are sort of winners now. But from a grander scheme, I think, I think we all sort of won with the legalization experiment.
But in terms of so those are the winners, but in terms of the losers here, you identify a sort of a racial element as well. It seems like primarily white folks got rich off of legalization, corporate white collar types, while racialized folks remain in prison from being incarcerated during that pre-legalization era. And that circle hasn't really been squared yet, has it?
All I can say to that is, I mean, that is true. And it was such a cash intensive business to get into when starting that you really needed huge pockets. I mean, when they were first starting, Terry Booth and Bruce, a safe could have cost $1 million. Like you just needed to burn through cash to get started. So that limited the playing field right away, and there was something like indigenous and black people were up to 7 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis charges than whites. And there was a statistics from the US that said basically the races pretty much use this stuff the same, you know. So that, but the arrest for cannabis through legalization is well down. So people aren't really getting busted for pot anymore. So that is a positive that the arrests are less of Black and Indigenous people. But in terms of ownership, I think right now there's only one. I mean, there's still like my friend Steven, and this company is called Chronic Relief. There's like one Black owned LP in the country, this many years after legalization. I mean, and that's absurd. And it's even I did a thing the other day where I said like, and playing reggae in these neighborhoods and like copping on Black culture, the hip hop culture with hip hop, while a white guy owns the dispensary and a white guy produces all the products and is obscene. I don't know, what's the word, but
Gross.
yeah, I mean, it's just disgusting, but you get it. Like you can see how that would be. I mean, I know that but I keep calling it out and people keep calling it out and it's not a secret. I guess things are changing, I guess, but like that is, I mean, and the other thing about that too is like how the rich get richer. Like the rich people who were rich when they got into this were rich when they got out of it. But the people in the barbershops or the people on Robinhood, all the people behind GameStop and all of these sort of like people who thought we would get high in day trade, those guys lost billions and billions of dollars. Like I think Deloitte did just fine, you know, but I think the people, as always with capitalism. I mean, the working man, who suffers? Those guys, us.
What do you hope people get out of the book?
I mean, I hope they enjoy it. I hope they remember. I mean, I did a thing for the Globe the other day where it was sort of like, right now, especially with the tariffs and everything, and where we need like domestic productivity, like we Canada didn't ask permission for many other countries. Like we moved on our own to legalize this stuff. It was our own companies. All of these people, Bruce and Terry and Vic at Afria. I mean, these were all Canadian entrepreneurs. So it's like a whole class of entrepreneur emerged and so much job creation. There's still more than 100,000 people that work in legal weed. So imagine what's the next legal weed? Like we just did this on our own, created this thing. We're the number one exporter of weed around the world. So we did that basically overnight with startups owned by Canadians, employing Canadians. So it's like we did that. We just did that. So we can do it again.
So what's next? Mushrooms?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like the mushrooms, that's what people are saying. And there's sort of like that same path where you sort of see those stores popping up all over the place. So you're like, is this already legal? Which is a lot what happened like with marijuana. And the mushroom things is good because it makes the medicinal case and it helps with people or ketamine, I don't know. But it seems that doesn't seem imminent, though there is testing and there is progress being made. But I think that the mushrooms, I just don't think that that's got a legalization recreation the way the pot did. But I'm curious, and there's certainly some of the same people have parked some of that same money, and there's some of that same hype. So, but I don't know. It seems pretty niche. It seems pretty niche. I don't know when the last time you took mushrooms was, but I don't think you're not going down to the store for a 6 pack of mushrooms and just watching the hockey game. Like it's an endeavor.
But with this book, then it's a rise and a fall. It's a success story, and it's so many other things at the same time. I guess you would say.
Yeah. And it's just, I just like it. I think it's very timely right now when everybody's trying to look at homegrown stuff. All of these CEOs and founders, you know, no one ever heard of before, but all sorts of different people were galvanized and a whole infrastructure started and a whole policy formed and all of these different things that we did here at home that hadn't been done anywhere else. And it just became huge. And it sort of dovetailed with when like Kawhi Leonard and the Raptors won and Drake was on top and like all of these things, like we had that minute and it seems like you could barely remember it anymore. I mean, Drake and the Raptors and weed are three things that were way on top in 2019 and are all at the bottom in 2025. But just like Drake and just like the Raptors, just like weed, we did it. We just did it so we can do it again. And I think that's the takeaway. That's the takeaway. There was nothing special about it. There was nothing about this that in a petri dish that has to be one of one at all. It's replicable.
The name of the book is Catch a Fire, The Blaze and Bust of the Canadian Cannabis Industry. It's published by Dundurn Press. My thanks to author Ben Kaplan.
Appreciate it so much.